My son said I'd receive nothing from my ex-wife's $34 million will. He sat there grinning during the reading, but then the lawyer read one line, and his smile froze. My son, Dustin, sat there beaming at his mother's will reading, certain her $34 million was all his. He didn't even glance my way, the ex-husband he openly despised. But then, the lawyer read just one sentence, and his smug smile vanished, replaced by a scream so loud the walls shook. You won't believe what happened next. Just a few days before, my life was, well, it was mundane. I was 65, wiping up spilled coffee, listening to my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, yell about my damn sprinklers flooding her begonias again. It was always something with those sprinklers, a loose joint I kept meaning to fix. I was down on my knees, ceramic shards from my coffee cup scattered around me, thinking, still cleaning up messes that aren't entirely my fault. Then the phone rang. I ignored it at first, trying to soak up the spreading coffee puddle, but it kept ringing, cutting through Eleanor's continued shouting next door. On the fifth ring, I finally picked it up. Jerry Flores speaking. A woman's voice. Janet Morrison, from a law firm in Cheyenne. That careful, professional tone, I'd learned to recognize it over the years. It always preceded bad news. I'm calling regarding Brianna Elizabeth Flores. My hand tightened around the receiver. Brianna Elizabeth Flores. Nobody had called her by her full name in my presence for 15 years. What about her? I asked, my voice suddenly tight. Sir, I'm very sorry to inform you that Mrs. Flores passed away on Tuesday evening. The funeral service is scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the kitchen chair, its familiar creak suddenly deafening in the silence that followed. Tuesday evening? That was 3 days ago. 3 days I'd been worrying about sprinkler systems and coffee stains while she was gone. Mr. Flores, are you there? Yes, I'm here. My voice sounded strange, distant, even to me. How did you get my number? Your name was listed in Mrs. Flores's personal effects as an emergency contact. I understand you were previously married. Previously married. 22 years of our lives, reduced to a legal footnote. Yes, I said, the word coming out automatically. We divorced in 2010. I see. Well, there will be a reading of the will following the service. You're named as a beneficiary, so your presence would be appreciated. Beneficiary. The word felt foreign, impossible. Brianna had built her empire after our divorce, transforming her small consulting business into something I only ever saw in newspaper articles. What on earth could she have possibly left me? Through the kitchen window, I could still see Eleanor Henderson, hands on her hips, examining her waterlogged begonias. Another confrontation was brewing, but her complaints seemed to come from another world now, muffled and utterly insignificant. The chapel, I said slowly, forcing myself to focus. Which one did you say? After hanging up, I just sat there, staring at the phone like it might ring again and deliver different news. Brianna. Vibrant, stubborn, impossible Brianna. Gone. The coffee stains on the floor had already begun to set, dark rings that would need scrubbing. But I couldn't move. Couldn't process this simple, devastating fact. The afternoon light slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing like memories I'd tried so hard to forget. As I sat there, her full name echoed in my mind, Brianna Elizabeth Flores. Each syllable pulled me backward through time, all the way to a snowy February evening in 1987. I was in Murphy's diner, mid-bite of my apple pie, when I heard her voice. Clear and uncompromising. A woman in a red wool coat arguing with the manager about his hiring practices. You're telling me you won't consider female applicants for weekend manager because women can't handle the pressure? That's the most ridiculous thing I've heard all week. She was magnificent in her anger. I secretly hoped the manager would keep arguing, just so I could listen to her tear his logic apart. She pulled a business card from her purse, slid it across the counter, and said, "When you change your mind about hiring based on qualifications rather than outdated assumptions, call me." As she left, the diner felt smaller, drained of electricity. I watched her climb into a blue Honda Civic. Careful, methodical, but not afraid to fight for what was right. "That one's trouble," the manager muttered. I stood, leaving a $5 bill next to my half-eaten pie. "No," I said, surprising myself with my certainty. "That one's extraordinary." The business card lay abandoned. Brianna Chin, business consultant. I memorized the number. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to call. She answered on the second ring, briskly. "Brianna Chin. This is Jerry Flores. We haven't met, but I saw you at Murphy's Diner on Friday night." A pause. Then, a smile in her voice. "The man with the apple pie who defended my honor to the manager. You heard that? You left a good tip, too." "So, Jerry Flores," she said. "What can I do for you?" "Have dinner with me somewhere better than Murphy's." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you asking me on a date, or do you need business consulting?" "Definitely a date. Though if you have any advice about convincing beautiful women to have dinner with strangers, I could use the consultation." She laughed. A real laugh. Saturday night, Romano's, 7 o'clock. She wore that same red coat to dinner, but underneath was a black dress that made my pulse race. We talked for 3 hours. Her childhood, my job at the power plant, our shared love for old movies. When she laughed at my story about accidentally flooding my apartment, I knew I was falling. 6 months later, I proposed in that same diner. "Marry me, Brianna Chin. Make me the luckiest man in Wyoming." She said yes before I'd even finished asking. Our wedding day blazed with September sunshine, making promises feel possible. "Forever," she whispered as I slipped the ring on her finger. And I believed her. Completely. 2 years later, Dustin arrived, a squalling, red-faced miracle. Brianna cradled him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else. I remember thinking, this perfect moment is all I'll ever need. But even then, I noticed her eyes occasionally drifting to the business magazine someone had left on the nightstand. As Dustin grew, I began to see things I'd missed. When he was 7, Brianna bought him a computer, a real machine, worth more than my monthly salary. "He needs to understand technology," she'd explained. "The future belongs to kids who think digitally." I'd suggested teaching him to fish instead. She laughed, but not kindly. We moved to a house with 3 bathrooms and a kitchen island bigger than our old apartment. Brianna's firm landed a huge contract, and suddenly, we had money for things I'd never imagined. A housekeeper, a fridge that dispensed ice, Dustin's bedroom looked like a toy store. "Isn't this wonderful?" she'd ask, gesturing at our new dining room. I missed our old kitchen table, scarred from Dustin's coloring projects and our late-night talks. This new table reflected light like a mirror, demanding coasters and placemats. The entertaining started immediately. Business associates, potential clients. Conversations revolved around market share and investment strategies. I'd wear my best shirt and try to contribute, but discussions about hedge funds left me feeling like I was speaking a foreign language. "Jerry works at the power plant," Brianna would explain, and I started hearing an apologetic edge in her voice, as if my job required an excuse. Dustin thrived in this new world. At 10, he discussed computer programming with her clients. At 12, he critiqued wine. At 14, he rolled his eyes at my camping suggestions, preferring Brianna's business conferences. "Dad doesn't understand," became his favorite phrase. Our first real fight came on Dustin's 15th birthday. Brianna planned a corporate networking event. Catered food, hired entertainment, a guest list full of business contacts. I wanted a barbecue, with his school friends. "This is embarrassing," I told her. He's 15, not 50. He's growing up in a different world than we did, Jerry, she said. These connections matter. These relationships will shape his future. What about just being a kid? She turned to me, and for a moment, I saw something cold in her eyes. Calculation. Being just a kid is a luxury we can't afford to give him. The world is competitive. Either we prepare him to win, or we prepare him to lose. My own 15th birthday flooded my mind, fishing with my father, a homemade cake. Simple, but perfect. The party was a success by Brianna's standards. Dustin charmed the adults. But I caught him once, standing alone by the pool, looking lost among all the sophisticated celebration. "You okay, buddy?" I asked. He quickly straightened, slipping back into the persona Brianna had helped him craft. Of course, why wouldn't I be? But for just a moment, I'd seen the confused little boy underneath all that premature sophistication, and it broke my heart. That party marked the beginning of the end. What followed was a 10-year slow-motion disaster, like watching a landslide from the bottom of a mountain. Inevitable, destructive, impossible to stop. Brianna's business consumed her time, her attention, her soul. Weekend family dinners became conference calls. Vacations were cancelled for client emergencies. Dustin's school events competed with board meetings, and the meetings always won. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she'd say when I complained about missing another of Dustin's baseball games. "This business supports our lifestyle. Someone has to make the hard choices." But I did understand pressure, the kind that came from keeping a power grid running, making sure thousands had electricity. The difference was my pressure served something larger than myself. By the time Dustin graduated high school, he'd become a stranger. Brianna had groomed him into her perfect prodigy, sharp, ambitious, dismissive of anything that didn't advance his prospects. When I suggested trade school along with college, he looked at me like I'd suggested he become a medieval serf. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding you back," he said, 17 years old and already talking like a business consultant. "You settled for mediocrity." I won't make that mistake. Settled for mediocrity, the words hit like physical blows. As if 25 years of keeping the lights on for our community meant nothing. As if being a steady, present father was somehow shameful. College made everything worse. Dustin went to business school, Brianna's alma mater, of course. He came home for holidays full of theories about market dynamics and personal optimization. He looked at our house, our life, our values with barely concealed contempt. "You could do more, Dad." As if my contentment was a personal failing. "Mom started with nothing and built an empire. You've had the same job for 20 years. Some things matter more than money," I'd reply, but he'd already stopped listening. The final explosion came during his senior year. Brianna was working 100-hour weeks on some massive acquisition. I was handling everything at home. When she missed Dustin's graduation because of a client crisis, I finally said what had been building for years. "This is enough, Brianna. Family has to come first sometimes." She stood in our kitchen, that crystal and granite shrine to success, still in her business suit at midnight, checking emails. "Don't you dare lecture me about priorities. Everything we have, everything Dustin's accomplished, exists because of my work. What about everything we've lost?" I shot back. "Like what?" She looked up from her phone, genuinely puzzled. "Like us. Like being a family instead of a corporation." She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw my answer in her eyes before she spoke. We weren't a family anymore. We were a business arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. "Maybe it's time we stopped pretending this is working," she said quietly. The divorce took 6 months. Brianna's lawyers were efficient, professional, devastating. I got the house on Maple Street, our old starter home, and enough money to live modestly. She got everything else, including Dustin's unquestioned loyalty. You're holding him back, too, Dustin told me during one of our last conversations before he moved to Denver to work for Brianna's company. All this guilt about family values and simple living. It's toxic, Dad. I can't be around that negativity anymore. I sat alone in my empty house afterward, surrounded by boxes of memories from a life that apparently meant nothing to the people I'd loved most. Now, 15 years later, the afternoon light was fading. My coffee had grown cold. Ceramic shards still scattered on the floor. Somewhere across town, funeral preparations were underway for the woman who'd once promised me forever. And I had no idea why my name was in her will. The 3 days leading up to the funeral passed in a strange, suspended state. I cleaned my apartment twice, pressed my one good suit, and rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Each morning I considered not going, but each evening found me committed to paying my respects, whatever the cost. Friday morning arrived, gray and cold. I adjusted the tie I hadn't worn in 5 years, wondering what Brianna would think of the man I'd become. The reflection showed someone older than I felt inside. Silver hair where brown used to be. Lines mapping the geography of quiet disappointments. The drive to Riverside Memorial Chapel took 20 minutes, past neighborhoods telling the story of Rock Springs' economic divide. My modest apartment complex gave way to manicured lawns and stone facades where Brianna's circle lived. The chapel itself, Gothic and imposing, suggested permanence and prosperity. Luxury cars lined the drive. My 15-year-old Honda felt like an intruder. Inside, the chapel whispered money, mahogany pews, stained glass, flowers arranged with artistic precision. At least 200 people. I recognized some faces from Brianna's business dinners. But most were strangers from the life she'd built after me. I slipped into a back pew, hoping to be invisible. But whispers followed. Her ex-husband. Can you believe he'd, after what he put her through? The stories had taken on their own life. In this version, I was the villain, the anchor who held back a brilliant woman. I'd learned long ago not to fight narratives that served other people's need for simple explanations. Dad! The voice cut through the chapel's murmur like a blade. I looked up. Dustin. Striding down the aisle, his face a mask of disbelief and barely controlled anger. At 37, he had Brianna's sharp features and commanding presence. Dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, success radiated from him. An expensive watch, a perfect haircut, the confident posture of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. What are you doing here? His voice carried across the chapel, turning heads. Silence. I stood slowly, meeting his gaze. I came to pay my respects. You lost the right to do that 15 years ago. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his aggressive cologne. She wouldn't want you here. Maybe not. But I needed to be here. For what? To ease your conscience? To play the grieving widower for people who know exactly what kind of husband you were? The chapel had gone completely quiet now. 200 pairs of eyes focused on our confrontation like spectators at a sporting event. I felt the familiar weight of judgment. But this time, something was different. This time, I had nothing left to lose. I'm not here to cause trouble, Dustin. I'll sit in the back. I won't speak to anyone. When the service ends, I'll leave. You'll leave now. His voice rose, drawing murmurs of approval. You embarrassed her enough when she was alive. Don't compound it by pretending to grieve her death. I remained standing, holding his stare. The chapel buzzed with anticipation. Someone coughed. Before I could respond, Dustin turned to address the gathered mourners, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms. I apologize for this disruption during what should be a time of remembrance. He gestured toward me with a casual dismissal, like swatting a fly. My father seems to have forgotten that divorce means you're no longer family. A few people nodded. Someone whispered agreement. Heat rose in my cheeks, but I forced myself to remain calm. For those who don't know, Dustin continued, warming to his theme. This is Jerry Flores, the man who spent 22 years holding back one of the most brilliant women this town has ever produced. While my mother was building an empire, he was content to punch a time clock and complain about her ambitions. Dustin, that's enough. The words came out harder than I intended. Is it? He turned back to the crowd, a prosecutor addressing a jury. Because I think these people deserve to understand why you're really here. He took half her assets in the divorce despite contributing nothing to her success. Then he spent 15 years acting like the victim while she built something magnificent. The crowd was fully engaged now. None of them met my eyes. She supported him for years while he refused to grow, refused to take risks, refused to be the partner she deserved. And now that she's gone, he shows up expecting sympathy, expecting to be treated like he mattered in her life. Each word landed like a physical blow. Not because they were entirely untrue, but because they reduced 22 years of marriage to a simple story of failure and blame. I thought about defending myself, explaining the complexity of what we'd shared, the love that had existed alongside the growing incompatibility. But what was the point? These people had chosen their narrative long ago. My mother died building something that will outlast all of us, Dustin concluded, his voice rising with conviction. She deserved a husband who would have helped her reach those heights, not one who tried to drag her down to his level. The chapel fell silent. I stood there, fully exposed, feeling the weight of 200 judgmental stares. Part of me wanted to walk out, to spare myself the humiliation. But another part, the part that had loved Brianna Chin more than anything else in the world, refused to be driven away from her final goodbye. Are you finished? I asked quietly. Dustin's eyes flashed with surprise. He'd expected me to crumble, to slink away in shame. When I remained standing, his confidence flickered. I loved your mother for 40 years, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chapel. 22 of them as her husband, 18 more as someone who wished her well despite everything that went wrong between us. I'm not here to make claims or demand recognition. I'm here because once upon a time, we made promises to each other that mattered, and I choose to honor that memory. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Dustin stood frozen in the aisle, clearly unprepared for resistance. The service began. I stayed. Through the eulogy that painted Brianna as a visionary. Through the readings from business associates who spoke of her leadership. When it ended, people filed past, offering condolences to Dustin while pointedly ignoring me. As the chapel emptied, I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion. The ordeal was nearly over. I could slip out, drive home to my quiet apartment, and try to forget this humiliating experience. Mr. Flores. A man in an expensive suit approached. Dan Morrison, from Morrison Welsh and Associates. He looked younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of someone who handled wealthy clients. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, extending his hand. We spoke briefly after the service. Thank you, I replied, shaking his hand. The service was very nice. Brianna would have appreciated it. Indeed. She was quite specific about her final arrangements. He glanced around the emptying chapel. I wonder if I might have a word with you and Dustin. There are some matters we need to discuss regarding Mrs. Flores's estate. Before I could respond, Dustin appeared at my shoulder, his expression shifting from practiced grief to alert interest. Dan, finally. I was wondering when we'd handle the business side of things. Of course, Dustin. These matters require careful attention. I'd like both of you to come to my office for the reading of your mother's will. Both of us? Dustin's eyebrows rose. Is that necessary? I mean, he's not, he gestured vaguely in my direction. Your father is specifically named in the will, Dan said calmly. That seemed unlikely. Probably some minor formality. I didn't want to prolong this. I don't think that's necessary, I said quietly. I'm sure it's just a formality. You don't need me there. Dan's eyes met mine directly. I'm afraid I do, Mr. Flores. Mrs. Flores was very specific about who should be present for the reading. Both you and Dustin must be there. Something in his tone suggested this wasn't negotiable. Dustin looked annoyed but shrugged with the casual confidence of someone who knew he had nothing to worry about. Fine, let's get this over with. He turned to me with barely concealed impatience. Try not to make this more difficult than it needs to be. The walk to Dan's office took us 3 blocks. His office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian house, dark wood, leather-bound books. Exactly the kind of place Brianna would have chosen, prestigious but respectful of tradition. Please have a seat. Dan gestured to 2 leather chairs. Dustin claimed the one closest to Dan, leaving me the one slightly to the side. Peripheral, just as I'd always been in their world. Dan settled behind his desk, opening a thick file folder, extracting legal documents with the careful precision of someone who'd done this countless times. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the suddenly quiet room. Before we begin, Dan said, adjusting his glasses. I want to express my condolences again. Brianna was not only a valued client but someone I considered a friend. Her loss is deeply felt. Dustin nodded solemnly. I remained silent, unsure what response was expected from someone whose relationship with the deceased was so complicated. Dan lifted the top document. This is the last will and testament of Brianna Elizabeth Flores, executed on March 15, 2024. It supersedes all previous wills. Only 14 months ago. I wondered what had prompted her to update it so recently. Had she been sick? The will confirms that Mrs. Flores was of sound mind and memory when these documents were prepared, and that she was under no undue influence or coercion. Dan's voice carried the formal cadence of legal proceedings. Dustin leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped, anticipation in his posture. A man preparing to claim his inheritance, to finally step fully into the empire his mother had built. Dan turned to the second page. I hereby make the following specific bequests and devises, he read. To my beloved son, Dustin Michael Flores, I leave the family home at 847 Hillrest Avenue, along with all furnishings, artwork, and personal property contained therein. Dustin smiled. A satisfied expression spread across his face. The Hillrest house was worth at least $800,000. Additionally, Dan continued, I bequeath to Dustin the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my primary investment account, $500,000 plus the house. I watched Dustin. His smile flickered. He was pleased, certainly, but I could see him calculating. $500,000 was significant, but Brianna's empire was worth far more. Where was the rest? Where was the company? That's wonderful, of course, Dustin said, a note of uncertainty he was trying to mask. But what about Mom's business interests? The company? Dan's expression remained professionally neutral. I'm continuing with the specific bequests, Dustin. Please allow me to finish. I shifted, feeling like an intruder. The bequest to Dustin, Dan continued, includes the following conditions. The inheritance is contingent upon his continued employment with Flores Consulting Solutions for a minimum of 2 years, or until such time as the company is sold or dissolved. Now Dustin looked genuinely confused. Conditions? What kind of conditions? And what do you mean, until the company is sold? Who would sell it? Mom would never sell the company. It was her life's work. I'm reading the will as written, Dustin. These are your mother's words, not mine. An attention I hadn't noticed before began to creep into the room. Dustin's confident posture shifted. His hands unclenching, then clenching again. I found myself leaning forward. Let me understand this clearly, Dustin said, his voice taking on an edge I recognized from the chapel. I get the house and $500,000, but there are strings attached? And you're talking about the company being sold? That doesn't make sense. Dan removed his glasses and cleaned them carefully. A gesture designed to give us a moment. When he replaced them, his gaze moved between Dustin and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your mother's will contains additional provisions that address the disposition of her remaining assets, he said quietly. The company, her investment portfolio, and several other significant holdings. Well, then let's hear them. Dustin demanded, his patience clearly wearing thin. What are these other provisions? I watched this, a growing unease in my gut. Something about Dan's manner suggested we were approaching territory none of us were prepared for. The careful way he parsed his words. The slightly apologetic tone. It reminded me of doctors delivering difficult news. Before I continue, Dan said, settling back. I want to emphasize that these documents represent Mrs. Flores's final considered wishes. They were prepared after extensive discussion, and she was adamant about their contents. The room fell silent, save for the tick of an antique clock. Dustin stared at the lawyer with growing alarm. I still wondered why Brianna had insisted I be present for what seemed like a straightforward family matter. Dan lifted the third page, his eyes scanning the text before looking up at both of us. However, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach tighten. There are additional provisions that fundamentally alter the distribution of Mrs. Flores's estate. He looked directly at me. That mix of sympathy and professional obligation. I knew then I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. The will contains provisions for the disposition of Mrs. Flores's remaining assets, which constitute the majority of her estate. Dustin leaned forward even further, gripping the armrests. Finally! Let's hear about the company and the rest of her investments. Dan returned his attention to the document, clearing his throat with the deliberate pause of someone about to deliver life-changing news. To my former husband, Jerry Michael Flores, he read, his words falling into the quiet office like stones into still water. I bequeath the sum of $33.5 million to be transferred from my primary investment accounts and securities portfolio. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. My mouth fell open. A physical reaction I couldn't control. $33.5 million. The number was so large it didn't seem real. It didn't seem to apply to someone like me, sitting in a lawyer's office in Rock Springs, Wyoming. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice strange, distant. Did you say 33 million? 33.5 million, yes. Dan's tone was professionally neutral, but I caught something in his eyes, the careful observation of someone watching expected chaos unfold. Dustin's face had gone completely white, then flushed red, as if his blood couldn't decide which direction to flow. What did you just say? Additionally, Dan continued, determined to deliver the complete bombshell, I transferred to Jerry Flores, controlling interest in Flores Consulting Solutions, including all subsidiary companies, real estate holdings, and business assets. This transfer includes 65% ownership of all corporate entities and an appointment as chairman of the board of directors. I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to tilt sideways, as if the laws of physics had suddenly changed. Controlling interest in Brianna's company? The empire I'd watched her build from nothing? The business that had consumed our marriage, the source of wealth that had made me feel so inadequate? She was giving it all to me. This can't be right. My voice was barely a whisper. There has to be some error. I assure you, Mr. Flores, there is no error. Dan removed his glasses again, cleaning them with methodical precision. These documents were prepared under Mrs. Flores's direct supervision. She reviewed every word multiple times and confirmed these were her exact wishes. Dustin shot to his feet so abruptly his chair rolled backward and struck the wall. This is impossible. She couldn't, he whirled, staring at me with pure disbelief mixed with something darker. What did you do? How did you manipulate her? I didn't do anything, I said weakly, still trying to process the impossibility. I haven't spoken to your mother in 15 years. Bullshit. The word exploded from Dustin like a gunshot. People don't just give away $33 million to their ex-husbands for no reason. You must have gotten to her somehow. Convinced her when she was sick, when she wasn't thinking clearly. Dan's voice cut through Dustin's rising hysteria with professional authority. I can assure you that Mrs. Flores was of completely sound mind when she executed these documents. She underwent a thorough mental competency evaluation, specifically to prevent any future challenges to the will's validity. I sat frozen, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. The numbers Dan had read, $33.5 million, controlling interest in a multi-million-dollar company, they belonged in a different universe than the one where I worried about grocery bills and car repairs. But why? I asked, the question emerging from some deep place of confusion and disbelief. Why would she do this? Dan gathered the will documents into a neat stack. Mrs. Flores left specific instructions regarding that question, Mr. Flores. She asked me to share a personal message with you after reading these provisions. Dustin's face contorted with rage and betrayal. A personal message? She left him a personal message but cut me out of everything that mattered? You received a substantial inheritance, Dustin, Dan replied calmly. $500,000 and a valuable property represent more wealth than most people see in their lifetimes. Compared to what he's getting? Dustin pointed at me with a shaking finger. You're talking about hundreds of millions in total assets. The company alone is worth more than everything else combined. The room pulsed with tension so thick I could taste it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I realized my entire life had just changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. But all I could focus on was the impossible fact that Brianna, stubborn, ambitious Brianna, who had grown to resent everything I represented, had somehow decided to give me everything she'd built. That's when Dustin completely lost control. This is fraud, he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. Criminal fraud. She was manipulated, coerced, mentally compromised. He whirled toward me, his face twisted with fury. You did something to her. There's no other explanation. I shrank back in my chair, overwhelmed by the violence of his reaction. Dustin, I swear to you, I had no contact with your mother. I didn't even know she was sick. Liar! He slammed his palm against Dan's desk, sending papers scattering. Nobody gives away everything they've built to someone who abandoned their family. Someone who couldn't even be bothered to call when she was dying. She didn't abandon anyone, I said quietly, finding some small reserve of strength. Our marriage ended, but that doesn't mean, it means exactly that. Dustin's voice rose to a near shriek. You walked away from us. You took your pathetic settlement and disappeared into your pathetic little life while she built an empire. And now you want me to believe she just decided to hand it all over to you? Dan's voice cut through the chaos. Mr. Flores, Dustin, I understand this is difficult news, but I must insist you control yourself. These are your mother's clearly stated wishes, executed with full legal authority. Dustin spun toward the lawyer, eyes blazing. I want every document examined. I want psychiatric evaluations. I want to know every single contact this man had with my mother in the past 5 years. There were no contacts, Dan replied calmly. Mrs. Flores made that very clear when she explained her decision. Explained her decision? Dustin's laugh was bitter and sharp. So, she did explain why she decided to betray her only son and give everything to the man who ruined her first marriage? She left a personal message for your father, yes. The word father seemed to hit Dustin like a physical blow. For just a moment, his rage flickered, and something else showed through, a pain so deep it made my chest ache. Then the fury returned, doubled in intensity. He's not my father. Dustin snarled. My father would have been there when she needed him. My father would have supported her dreams instead of trying to drag her down. He turned back to me, his face contorted with years of accumulated resentment. You're nothing but a failed man who couldn't handle being married to someone better than you. Each word landed like a knife thrust. Not because they were entirely false, but because they contained enough truth to draw blood. I had felt inadequate during those final years. I had struggled with Brianna's success. I had been the one who couldn't adapt to the world she was creating. Maybe you're right, I said quietly. Maybe I wasn't the husband she deserved. But I never asked for this. I never expected this. Expected? Dustin's voice climbed another octave. You orchestrated this. Somehow, some way, you got to her when she was vulnerable. When she was sick or scared or, that's enough, Dan interrupted, his professional patience finally showing strain. Mrs. Flores was neither sick nor vulnerable when she made these decisions. She was, in fact, more determined and clear-minded than I'd ever seen her. Then why? Dustin demanded, his voice breaking slightly. Why would she do this to me? I was everything she wanted me to be. I worked for her company. I lived the life she planned for me. I became the son she could be proud of. The pain in his voice cut through my own shock. Despite everything, the years of hostility, the public humiliation, the bitter accusations, I saw him clearly for a moment, a man who had spent his entire adult life trying to earn his mother's approval, only to discover she'd given her ultimate validation to someone else. She left a message explaining her reasoning, Dan said gently. Would you like me to read it? Dustin's hands were shaking now, his whole body vibrating with suppressed rage and grief. A message? She couldn't explain it to my face, but she left a message for him? The message addresses both of you, actually, Dan clarified. It was meant to be shared after the will reading. I found my voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Maybe we should hear what she had to say. Dustin's eyes locked on mine with pure hatred. You have no right to make decisions here. You have no right to any of this. But even as he spoke, I could see the desperate need in his expression. The need to understand why his mother had chosen to shatter everything he'd believed about his place in her world. Dan raised his hand, commanding silence. Enough, both of you. Before this goes any further, I have something that will explain everything. He opened the manila envelope with Brianna's distinctive handwriting across the front, extracting several pages of cream-colored stationery. Brianna knew this moment would be difficult. She asked me to read this personal message after the will was announced. Dustin slumped back into his chair, his rage momentarily displaced by desperate curiosity. I remained frozen, afraid to hope for understanding, but desperate for any explanation that might make sense of this impossible situation. Dan cleared his throat and began reading in Brianna's own words, My dearest Jerry, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone, and you're probably sitting in Dan's office wondering if the entire world has lost its mind. I can picture your face. That expression you used to get when I'd rearrange the living room furniture without warning, confused, but trying to be polite about it. Despite everything, my lips curved into the ghost of a smile. She'd captured that expression perfectly, and somehow, hearing her voice through Dan's reading made her feel present in the room. I know this inheritance comes as a shock. I know you're probably thinking there's been some terrible mistake, that you don't deserve this money or this responsibility. But Jerry, you're wrong. You deserve every penny, and I'm going to tell you why. I never stopped loving you. Not during our worst fights. Not during the divorce proceedings. Not during these 15 years of stubborn silence. I was angry with you for not understanding my ambitions, but I was angrier with myself for choosing those ambitions over our marriage. You tried to save us, Jerry. You begged me to find balance, to remember what mattered. I was too proud and too afraid to listen. The words hit me like physical blows. Tears started, hot and unexpected, as decades of guilt and regret crystallized into this moment of impossible absolution. "Dustin," the message continued, and I saw my son's head snap up. "My beautiful, brilliant boy, I know you're furious right now. Probably convinced your father somehow manipulated me. But sweetheart, you're not ready for this inheritance. Not yet. You've lived your entire adult life in the shadow of my success. Accepting the benefits without understanding the responsibility. You've never had to build something from nothing. Never had to make the hard choices that wealth requires. More importantly, you've spent 15 years hating a good man for crimes he never committed." "That's not true," Dustin whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dan continued, "Jerry taught me about character, about integrity, about the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or judgment. I forgot those lessons when I chose money over marriage, business over love. But I never forgot the man who taught them to me." I was crying openly now, not caring how it looked. Brianna's words were rebuilding something inside me that I thought was permanently broken. The sense that I had value, that my quiet life of dignity and service meant something. "Dustin, you have received enough to live comfortably and explore who you might become without the weight of unlimited wealth. Learn to build something yourself. Learn to value people over profit. Learn to forgive your father for the crime of being human and imperfect." Dustin made a sound like a wounded animal. Rage? Pain? I couldn't tell. "Jerry, you're inheriting more than money. You're inheriting the chance to do what I should have done, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than a weapon for proving superiority. I trust you because you never wanted this. Because you'll never use it to hurt people the way I sometimes did." When Dan finished reading, the office fell into profound silence. I sat with tears on my cheeks, overwhelmed by the gift of knowing that Brianna had loved me until the end. Dustin stared at the floor, his entire worldview crumbling around him. Finally, Dan folded the letter carefully. "She asked me to give this to you, Jerry. The original is yours to keep." I reached for it with trembling hands, holding the last conversation I would ever have with the woman who had shaped my life in ways both beautiful and painful. The weight of Brianna's words settled over the office like dust after an explosion. For several minutes, none of us spoke. I held her letter against my chest, feeling the physical reality of her final gift. Not just the money, but the restoration of my worth in her eyes, and more importantly, in my own. Dustin was the first to break the silence. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but the fire had gone out of his voice. "I can contest this. Mental incapacity, undue influence, fraud. There are ways to challenge a will." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since we'd entered Dan's office. I saw a man who had spent his entire life expecting the world to bend to his wishes, who had never learned that love couldn't be inherited or demanded. Only earned. "You could try," I said gently. "But your mother was right, Dustin. You're not ready for this responsibility. And I am." His laugh was bitter, hollow. "You're a nobody, Dad. A retired power plant worker with no business experience, no connections, no understanding of what it takes to run a company worth hundreds of millions." For a moment, the old Jerry, the one who had felt inadequate for 22 years, wanted to agree with him. But Brianna's words echoed in my mind, "You deserve every penny." "Maybe you're right," I said, standing up slowly. "Maybe I don't know anything about running a business empire. But I know something your mother valued more than business expertise." "What's that?" "I know the difference between serving others and serving myself." Dustin's face twisted with a final flash of rage. "This is insane. She was sick. She was old. She wasn't thinking clearly." Dan's voice cut through the outburst with professional finality. "Your mother was 62 years old and in perfect mental health when she executed these documents. She underwent extensive psychological evaluations specifically to prevent the kind of challenges you're threatening. Then why? Dustin's voice cracked like a teenager's. Why would she do this to me? I felt a surge of unexpected compassion for this angry man who was, despite everything, still my son. She didn't do it to you, Dustin. She did it for you. She gave you a chance to discover who you are when you're not living in the shadow of unlimited wealth. I don't want that chance. The words exploded from him, carrying the force of 15 years of entitlement and expectation. I want what's rightfully mine. What's rightfully yours, I said quietly, is $500,000 and a house worth nearly $1 million. That's more than most people see in a lifetime. What you think you deserved was never really yours to begin with. Dustin stared at me for a long moment, and I saw him realize that something fundamental had changed. The man he'd publicly humiliated that morning, the father he dismissed as a failure, was no longer asking for his approval or understanding. You think you've won? He said, gathering his coat with shaking hands. You think this makes you some kind of hero? No, I replied, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. I think it makes me responsible. He stood at the office door for a moment, seeming smaller than when he'd entered. This isn't finished. Yes, it is, I said gently. This finished the moment your mother made her choice. The only question now is what you do with the life she's given you. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. Dan began organizing papers on his desk. There will be paperwork to complete, accounts to transfer, board meetings to schedule. The company's current management team is excellent. They can help you transition into your new role. I nodded, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. Dan, I asked, my voice a little rough. Can I ask you something? Of course. Did she really love me? Even after everything that went wrong between us? He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all day. Jerry, she talked about you every time we met. Not about the divorce, not about the problems. About the man who taught her that success without character is just expensive failure. I walked out of that office a different man than the one who had entered. The afternoon sun felt warmer, the air cleaner. I had work to do, responsibilities to embrace, a company to learn about and improve. But for the first time in 15 years, I felt worthy of the challenge. Justice, I realized, wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about recognition. The recognition that character matters more than credentials, that patience outlasts entitlement, and that love, real love, never truly dies. Brianna had seen all of that, and in her final act, she had given me the chance to prove her right. What would you have done in my shoes? How would you react to a situation like this? Do you think Brianna made the right choice? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear what you think.